What if victory arrived smelling like gasoline and death? The morning mist hung thick over the Ardennes as Colonel Otto Reinhardt stood before endless rows of captured American fuel barrels. 50,000 gallons of stolen firepower gleamed under a colorless sky. Around him, his men shouted, their laughter brittle, echoing through the fog like ghosts pretending to be alive. Otto's face was drawn, his breath shallow, his eyes pale with exhaustion rather than triumph. He thought of home, of cities reduced to ash, of the quiet voice inside him, whispering that no fuel could keep a broken empire alive. Sergeant Kruger lit a cigarette, his hands trembling. Lieutenant Franz Weber, sharp and cold, watched his commander for weakness. An American prisoner sat on the frozen ground, bound but breathing, confusion painted across his face. Somewhere beyond the tree line, thunder rolled. It wasn't the weather, it was tanks coming closer. Otto closed his eyes. Victory had never felt so final, or so empty. Night descended like a slow breath, swallowing the camp in silence. The barrels gleamed faintly beneath the moon, guarded by men too tired to care. Otto sat in his tent, staring at a faded map, the lines of retreat drawn thicker than the lines of attack. Outside, Franz barked orders, forcing soldiers to form defensive posts around a victory already fading in meaning. Kruger entered quietly, bringing word of more prisoners and less food. Otto didn't answer. He simply traced his finger along the map, from Ardennes to Berlin, and whispered that none of it mattered anymore. When he finally looked up, his reflection in a cracked mirror stared back. A soldier who no longer knew what side he stood on. At dawn, Otto walked through the camp. The barrels stood untouched, frozen like monuments to a dead ambition. He passed rows of sleeping soldiers, faces sunken and pale. Franz followed, notebook in hand, recording numbers that meant nothing anymore. A pair of guards led the captured Americans to the center. Private Louis Clark stumbled, his lips blue, but his eyes still alive with something Otto hadn't seen in his own men for months. Hope. Otto stopped and stared at him. For a long moment neither spoke. Then the colonel turned away, whispering, "Feed them." Franz burst into Otto's tent, his face pale with anger. He slammed a report onto the table. Orders from Berlin demanding the fuel be moved east. "They still think there's a front left," he hissed. Otto didn't respond. Outside, Kruger's voice shouted as the men struggled to dig vehicles from the snow. "It's over," Otto said finally. Franz glared at him, the silence between them heavier than the air itself. "Then act like a soldier," Franz replied. Otto stood slowly, his shadow long on the tent wall. "I am," he said. "I'm just not sure which army I belong to anymore." That night, a thin wind carried whispers through the camp. Otto stood alone beside the barrels, hearing them creak softly in the cold. The American prisoner sang something faint, a tune about home. It drifted through the stillness like a confession. Otto closed his eyes and imagined Berlin burning, the cries of mothers, the lies of generals. For the first time, he envied the prisoner, not his freedom, but his clarity. Somewhere deep inside, Otto felt a choice taking shape, fragile but certain. When he opened his eyes again, the snow had stopped, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Snow fell quietly that morning, soft as ash from a distant fire. Otto Reinhardt stood before the barrels again, his breath slow, his thoughts heavier than his boots sinking into frost. The victory felt smaller now, like a rumor that had outlived its believers. His men whispered that reinforcements were coming, but the radio stayed silent, broken by static and the faint voice of propaganda no one trusted anymore. Kruger walked up, his face pale, saying that 2 soldiers had deserted in the night. Otto didn't react. He stared at the forest where their footprints vanished, envying them for their choice. In the distance, Franz paced the camp, restless, clutching Berlin's orders as if they meant salvation. The sound of dripping fuel from a cracked barrel broke the silence. Otto turned toward it, watching the precious liquid seep into the snow like spilled blood. Even victory, he muttered. Leaks when it's empty. The camp had begun to rot from the inside. The fuel, the food, the faith, all running out. Otto gathered his officers in the command tent. The map was torn and greasy, its borders meaningless now. Franz slammed his hand on the table, shouting that the barrels must reach the eastern front. Kruger snorted, whispering that there was no front left to reach. Silence cut through the room like a knife. Otto raised his eyes and asked one question. If Berlin lies, do we still obey? Franz froze. The younger men looked away. No one answered. For the first time, the war felt not like an order, but a question. Later that day, Otto walked with Kruger beyond the perimeter, following the edge of the frozen forest. They spoke in quiet tones about home. Kruger about his wife's last letter. Otto about the silence from his own. The forest was eerily still, broken only by the distant thump of artillery miles away. Otto stopped by a tree, pressed his gloved hand against the bark, and whispered that he no longer knew who they were fighting for. Kruger didn't answer. He just looked toward the camp and said, "We're fighting to survive the men who lead us." The words lingered in the frost like smoke that wouldn't fade. When they returned, the prisoners were gone. Franz stood in the center of camp, face flushed with fury, soldiers scrambling behind him. He accused Otto of ordering their release, shouting that it was treason. Otto said nothing. The wind carried the smell of spilled fuel and burning wood. Kruger met Otto's eyes, a silent question between them. Had he done it? Otto looked away. "We can't win," he said quietly. Franz's face twisted. "Then you don't deserve to lead." For a moment, the camp seemed to hold its breath, and in that stillness, loyalty cracked like thin ice. That night, Otto couldn't sleep. The camp was quiet, except for the groaning of frozen metal and the slow drip of melting snow. He stepped outside, gazing toward the horizon. The barrels stood like tombstones beneath the moonlight, their shadows long and cold. He heard footsteps. Kruger. The sergeant handed him a note. "They're coming." Inspection. Otto folded it slowly, eyes empty. He looked at the fuel, at the men sleeping in rags, and whispered, "They'll take what's left and hang the rest." Kruger asked what they would do. Otto looked at the stars. "Tell them," he said, "we have nothing left to give but truth." By midday, the black cars arrived. Their engines purred like predators in the snow. Out stepped Major Dietrich Voss, the man Otto had hoped would never come. His coat was immaculate, his gloves spotless, his eyes as cold as the steel pistol on his belt. Around him, Otto's men stood stiffly, fear hidden behind obedience. Voss smiled without warmth and congratulated Otto for his victory. Then his tone darkened. "Berlin wants answers," he said. "Where are the prisoners?" Silence rippled through the camp. Otto's heart pounded, but his face stayed still. Voss walked closer, his boots crunching in the snow. "The Führer rewards loyalty," he whispered, "and punishes mercy." Otto looked at him and replied softly, "Then I suppose we are both in danger." Voss inspected the barrels one by one, his gloved hand brushing each as though he were counting sins. Otto followed silently, his men watching from a distance. "You've done well," Voss said. 50,000 gallons, enough to keep the war alive for another week." Otto didn't answer. Voss stopped beside a cracked barrel, fuel dripping onto snow. He dipped a finger in the liquid and rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger. "Such waste," he muttered. "When men bleed for less." Then he turned sharply. "You'll prepare this for transport tonight." Otto met his gaze. "There's no transport left," he said. Voss's smile faded. "Then you will build one?" His voice was quiet, but it carried like a gunshot. Later, inside the tent, Voss poured himself coffee while Otto stood silent by the table. "Your loyalty is uncertain," Voss said calmly. "Your men are weak, and yet Berlin thinks you can still serve." Otto met his eyes. Serve what, Major? A ghost. The SS officer smiled faintly. Serve order. Even ghosts need soldiers. Otto felt the weight of the war pressing down on his chest. If order means killing for nothing, he said, then I'm no soldier. Voss stood, slowly removing his gloves. Be careful, Colonel, he whispered. Truth is treason when the lie still has bullets. Outside, wind scraped against the canvas like claws. Outside, Franz gathered the men, his voice sharp as frost. Major Voss is here to restore order, he shouted. Some soldiers nodded, others stared at the ground. Kruger leaned close to Otto, whispering, Hell break them before the enemy does. Otto said nothing, but inside he felt a growing storm. The SS trucks idled, black smoke curling into the sky. Otto watched Voss move among his men, promising food, medals, and forgiveness, all for obedience. When he finished, Otto stepped forward. You promised too much, he said. Voss turned, his eyes glinting. And you believe too little. Snow began to fall again, each flake like ash between them. That evening, Otto sat alone by the fire, staring at the flickering light. He heard Voss's voice outside, giving orders to execute deserters at dawn. Otto's heart tightened. He rose and stepped out into the cold night. Franz stood nearby, his expression torn between duty and doubt. You'll follow those orders? Otto asked. Franz's lips trembled before he said, If I don't, someone else will. Otto looked past him toward the fuel barrels, their metal skins glowing faintly in the firelight. Then I suppose, he said, I'll have to stop someone else. The night wind hissed through the camp, carrying the smell of oil and fear. The morning arrived pale and cruel. The men stood in formation as two deserters were dragged forward, their faces ghostly beneath the frost. Otto's chest ached as Voss read the charges. Franz stood beside him, eyes fixed ahead, lips pressed tight. When the gunfire came, it was brief but deafening, echoing through the trees like a judgment. The bodies fell silently into snow that refused to stay white. Otto turned away, his stomach hollow. Voss smiled thinly and announced that loyalty had been restored. Otto wanted to speak, to shout, but the words wouldn't come. Kruger's eyes met his across the yard, filled with the same wordless horror. In that moment, Otto knew the war was no longer about nations or flags. It was about men trying to remember their souls before losing them forever. After the execution, the camp felt colder than ever. Franz followed Otto into his tent, his voice trembling with a strange mix of anger and guilt. You made me watch, he said. Otto looked up, startled. We both watched. Franz shook his head. You did nothing. You could have stopped it. Otto's hands clenched on the table. And be next, he said softly. Franz's eyes burned with something close to hatred. At least I'd still believe in something. He turned and stormed out, leaving Otto in silence, his reflection flickering in the lantern's flame. Two faces, both defeated by different kinds of fear. That night, whispers spread through the camp. Otto could feel the distrust thick in the air. Voss had left, promising to return with reinforcements. Franz gathered a small group of loyalists, their eyes cold and eager. Kruger warned Otto quietly that something was wrong. He's building something, he said. A case against you. Otto nodded slowly. Then he'll need proof, but inside, he knew proof didn't matter anymore. Only belief did, and belief had already turned against him. He walked outside, snow crunching underfoot, watching Franz talk to soldiers in the dark. The lines of war had shifted. They weren't drawn between nations now, but between men who had once shared bread. Franz came for him before dawn. The soldiers entered Otto's tent with rifles raised. Otto didn't move. You're relieved of command, Franz said, voice shaking slightly. On suspicion of treason. Otto looked up, calm and tired. You've learned from Voss, he murmured. Franz hesitated. No, I learned from you, how not to care. The soldiers dragged Otto outside, forcing him to his knees beside the barrels he had once called victory. Kruger appeared, trying to intervene, but Franz barked an order that froze him in place. The snow fell harder now, thick and silent. Otto looked at his men and whispered, "You're fighting shadows." Hours later, Kruger freed him. No words, no plan, just quiet understanding. "They'll shoot us both," Otto whispered. Kruger shrugged. "Then, at least it'll mean something." Together, they slipped into the forest, the barrels and tents shrinking behind them until the camp became only smoke and memory. In the distance, faint explosions rolled through the mountains. "The Americans are close," Kruger said. Otto nodded, his breath trembling. "Maybe they'll end what we couldn't." For the first time, Otto smiled. Small, sad, but real. The snow muffled their footsteps, as if the earth itself wanted to hide them. The forest swallowed them whole. Snow muted every sound except the crunch of their boots and the faint hum of war echoing miles away. Otto walked ahead, his breath clouding in the freezing air, his thoughts flickering between guilt and resolve. Kruger followed close, clutching his rifle, not as a weapon, but as a memory of duty. When they found the American prisoners huddled in a makeshift shelter, cold, hungry, but alive, Otto felt something shift inside him. Private Lewis Clark looked up, eyes wide with disbelief. Otto raised his hands slowly. "We're not your enemies anymore," he said. Clark hesitated, then nodded. In that fragile silence, surrounded by snow and ruin, Otto finally chose to fight for humanity, not command. They shared what little they had: bread, a dented canteen, silence. The Americans didn't ask why. They just accepted it. Kruger sat close to the fire, staring into the flames as though seeing ghosts. "They'll call this treason," he said. Otto nodded. "Then let them. We've done worse things in obedience." Clark watched them quietly, trying to understand the men who had once hunted him. "Why help us?" he asked finally. Otto smiled faintly. "Because you're still alive. And that's more than most can say." Outside, the forest creaked with wind, and for a fleeting moment, the war felt far away. Like a nightmare they were all slowly waking from. At dawn, Otto scouted ahead while Kruger guarded the Americans. He moved silently through the trees until he saw black smoke rising from the east. German trucks coming fast. Panic sparked in his chest. He ran back, breath burning his throat. "They found us," he gasped. Kruger rose instantly. The Americans looked terrified. Otto grabbed Clark by the shoulder. "You go north," he said. "There's a river," he said. "There's a river. Cross it, and you'll find your people." Clark stared at him. "What about you?" Otto smiled faintly. "We'll stay. Someone has to lead them the wrong way." The decision was made before fear could protect. They split just before sunrise. Otto and Kruger moved south, leaving tracks meant to mislead pursuit. Behind them, the Americans vanished into the fog. Every step felt heavier, the weight of choice pressing into Otto's spine. Kruger finally broke the silence. "You think they'll make it?" Otto nodded slowly. "They have to." He looked toward the rising smoke of the oncoming convoy and whispered, "If one of them remembers we tried, that's enough." Snow began to fall again, soft and relentless. The forest, once a prison, now felt like absolution. By midday, they reached an abandoned farmhouse. Inside, the air smelled of dust and burned wood. Otto collapsed onto a broken chair, his body shaking from exhaustion. Kruger handed him a canteen, whispering, "You did right." Otto looked out the shattered window at the gray horizon. "Right doesn't matter anymore," he said, "but it's something." In the distance, engines rumbled. The sound of voices returned. Otto straightened, eyes calm now. "Hell follow our tracks," he said. Kruger nodded. "Then we wait." The two men sat in silence, soldiers no longer, waiting not for rescue, but for reckoning. The first shells fell before dawn. The ground trembled, shaking loose the snow from broken rafters above the farmhouse. Otto and Kruger crouched low as the air filled with the sound of tearing metal and splintering wood. "They're close!" Kruger shouted, but Otto didn't move. He peered through the window, watching black SS trucks crawl through the fog like insects. Voss was coming. Otto felt no fear, only a tired calm. "It was always going to end here," he said softly. Kruger reloaded his rifle, his hands steady, eyes hollow. The war outside roared, but inside a strange peace settled. The kind that comes when there's nothing left to lose, only something left to defend. Gunfire cracked through the silence, sharp and fast. Bullets tore into the farmhouse walls, spraying wood and snow in every direction. Otto returned fire without hesitation, each shot deliberate, measured, calm. Kruger shouted over the chaos, "They'll surround us." Otto nodded, eyes fixed on the distant line of black uniforms moving like shadows. "Then let them," he said. "They're following ghosts." For every shot that came, Otto fired back, not to win, but to remind the world that conscience still fought, even when the body was tired of war. The smoke thickened, curling around the light like fading breath. The attack paused. Silence fell, thick, eerie, almost holy. Through the window, Otto saw Voss stepping out of his car, pristine even amidst ruin. His boots left neat prints in the bloodied snow. He raised a megaphone and called out, "Colonel Reinhardt, surrender. There's no honor in death." Otto looked at Kruger, whose face was streaked with soot. "There's no honor left in life either," he replied quietly. Kruger smiled weakly. "Then I'll die beside a man who finally learned to see." Otto's eyes softened, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. The next shell struck close, shattering the roof and flooding the room with snow and debris. Kruger fell, hit in the shoulder. Blood spread fast across his coat. Otto dragged him behind a beam, hands trembling but steady. "Leave me," Kruger groaned. "Not yet," Otto muttered. He tore a strip from his sleeve, pressing it to the wound. Outside, gunfire resumed, louder now. "They're not stopping," Kruger whispered. Otto met his eyes, voice low. "Neither will we." For a fleeting second, two broken soldiers held the line. Not for flags, not for glory, but for the quiet idea that doing right, even at the end, still mattered. By noon, the firing stopped. The silence was louder than any battle. Otto knelt beside Kruger, whose breathing had grown shallow. "It's over," Otto whispered. Kruger smiled faintly. "Then we finally won something." His eyes drifted shut, peaceful at last. Otto stood slowly, stepping out into the open snow. The air was still, the world strangely calm. Voss approached from the smoke, pistol drawn. Otto didn't move. "You should have stayed loyal," Voss said. Otto looked him in the eyes. "I finally am." The shot echoed once. As Otto fell, the wind lifted the snow into the air, erasing footprints, faces, and flags alike, leaving only white. Days passed before the Americans found what remained of the battlefield. Snow had buried the farmhouse and softened the scars of violence. Private Louis Clark led the patrol, his breath freezing in the morning air. When he saw the two bodies, one German, one clutching the other's hand, he stopped. The older man's coat still bore the insignia of a colonel. "Sir," a soldier whispered, "what do we do?" Clark knelt beside them, brushing frost from Otto Reinhardt's face. "There was no hate left in it, only peace. We bury them," Clark said quietly. "They fought for something no uniform can name." In that moment, the war felt both infinite and suddenly very small. As they dug graves in the frozen ground, the sound of shovels echoed softly, like slow breathing. Clark couldn't stop looking at Otto's face, at the quiet that lingered there. One of his men found a small notebook in the colonel's pocket, pages filled with short, trembling words. "No side owns the truth," it read, "but every man dies trying to find it." Clark closed the book and slipped it into his coat. The wind howled gently, carrying snow across the mounds of earth. "He wasn't my enemy," Clark whispered. "He was just another man trying to wake up from the same nightmare." For the first time, the silence felt like forgiveness. That night, Clark sat by the fire with the small notebook open on his lap. The men around him slept, their snores blending with the crackling wood. He read Otto's words again and again, the ink smudged by frost and blood. "If truth is treason, then may we all be traitors." Clark stared into the flames, feeling something shift inside him, a faint understanding of how even enemies could share the same ghosts. He thought of the colonel's tired eyes, the way he'd lowered his weapon that day in the forest. "Maybe he didn't lose," Clark murmured. "Maybe he just stopped fighting the wrong war." When the snow melted weeks later, Allied officers reviewed reports from the Ardennes, among them a file marked Reinhardt, Otto, status, deceased. A young clerk paused, reading the final line written by an American private. "Buried with honor." The officer looked puzzled. "A German?" he asked. "Yes, sir," the clerk replied. "One who chose not to obey." The officer said nothing, only nodded. Somewhere far away, the river thawed, carrying fragments of burned maps and forgotten orders downstream. The war was ending, but its lessons were only beginning to surface, quietly, like the dead beneath the snow. Years later, in a small German village reborn from ashes, a young boy placed flowers on a nameless grave beside a crumbling church. His grandmother told him it belonged to a soldier who'd once disobeyed orders to save strangers. "Was he a hero?" the boy asked. She smiled faintly. "He was human." The wind carried her words across the quiet graveyard, rustling leaves and memories alike. Somewhere, the snow had long melted, but its silence still lingered. In every story told about men who learned too late that justice isn't written by the victors, but by the ones who dared to do what was right when no one else would. Whoa.